And I think that they do a good job of being like, okay, if like a nurse that you're working with is doing something that you don't think is right, come talk to me. But there's not much of like, if I'm doing something that you don't think is right, come talk to me. Sometimes there is, but it's more related to clinical stuff and less related to diversity issues, which I think tend to be a bit more sensitive.
Just as we're talking to our clinical instructors, we talk to our students, we talk to our staff, we really talk to everybody in the Hopkins family about diversity. This is a really critical issue for us, for all of Johns Hopkins and the School of Nursing, and we really just want to make sure that everybody in our family is acting in the same way.
Definitely. The bar is higher for clinical instructors because they're on the front line.
I remember like kind of being in tears almost, like I'm actually thinking about it now. Kind of being in tears when she kind of said that and kind of feeling singled out.
I'm not sure if it did put me into a good place.
Because they spend an ample amount of time with the students.
I guess I was such in disbelief that this happened and this was said.
I think she did a really good job of making sure that we were being aware ourselves, that we were not all coming from the same place as our patients or as the nurses we were working with or as each other, and realizing that requires us to take a step back.
Hi, my name is Nicole Warren, and I'm a faculty member here at the Johns Hopkins University School of Nursing. Respect for and inclusion of diversity is a priority at the university and definitely at the School of Nursing, where it's been identified as one of our core values. This video about diversity is intended for you, clinical instructors. After all, it's you who are on the front lines with students in the clinical setting, and you are really the face of the School of Nursing for all of our clinical partners and patients. You are an incredibly important part of the educational team.
To me, clinical instructors are integral to enacting the vision and mission of our school. In essence, they are really operationalizing everything that we teach in the classroom.
Definitely. The bar is higher for clinical instructors because they're on the front line. They are guests at the institution. They are there as role models for our students, and they need to set the standards and the expectations that we here at the school value and expect.
In fact, they were stereotyping students, stereotyping patients, and students were really being put in uncomfortable situations because of that. We just really thought that, we need to make sure clinical instructors know how important this is and how important it is to model the behavior.
What you say and do about diversity really matters. So what exactly are we talking about when we talk about diversity? It's been defined in so many ways. You might think about it in terms of race, religion, could be sexual orientation, could just be different abilities that people have or don't have. There's so many things that make us diverse. And nothing makes a bigger impact on how our students learn how to manage diversity in the clinical setting than watching you at work and hearing what you say or don't say. Your assumptions become theirs. Your ability to separate fact from gossip, for example, in a report, students learn all of that from you. So the purpose of this video is to share some stories, some inspiring and some concerning, about how diversity is being managed in the clinical setting. In addition to making you aware of the school's expectations about respecting diversity when you're working with us as an instructor, we'll also share some strategies to help you make that happen. To make this video, we talked to students, faculty, and staff, so I think you'll recognize some faces. So first, let's hear from some students about the positive impact clinical instructors have had on them when it comes to diversity issues.
So that happened to me a lot during my one clinical, and my instructor was nice enough to come in and with me speak to the patient, saying that this is a professional, although he's a different gender, he's going to respect you fully, and this shouldn't be a deterrent because it's a professional individual, and that was huge.
So one thing that she would tell us was to make sure that we were always asking beforehand and not assuming things. So like if the person, for example, the person was a different color than us, or, something in their history might hint at a lifestyle that was not something that we were familiar with, that it was okay to ask, and that can sometimes seem intrusive or unnecessary. And her main point was that if you don't ask, then you're going to make assumptions, and that's going to be much worse.
I've actually been asked to interpret multiple times while I'm on the floor. And I talk to my clinical instructors, and they actually talk to me and they tell me, like, you know what, Mark, your job is not to be an interpreter. Your job is to be a student and to learn. And so they really stand behind us in those instances to make sure that we don't overstep our bounds.
Just on the very first day of setting the tone of this is something that impacts health that you aren't taught in your class, but it's something that you have to be cognizant of, was a really great skill to have just set out on the first day.
And the parents had chosen to give up the child for adoption because they couldn't afford the care that was required and they couldn't afford the emotional commitment that went into that. That made me very sad and kind of frustrated to hear, but they were great at pointing out that, you know, that could have been a really difficult decision for the parents to make, and it really might be in the kids' best interest. And I was very impressed that they were able to kind of turn that situation around, you know, and make me see the bright side, potentially.
Well, we had a transgender patient, and we had a lot of people from the LGBT community, and lots of people, both nurses and patients, from international countries. And I think she did a really good job of making sure that we were being aware ourselves, that we were not all coming from the same place as our patients or as the nurses we were working with or as each other, and realizing that requires us to take a step back and find out where the people that we were working with are coming from before we, you know, sort of bulldozed in there.
Amazing. There's no doubt that instructors can set the tone and model how to respect and promote diversity. But as you know, sometimes things don't always go as well. Let's take a look at some of those examples.
For this clinical instructor to tell me that my hair wasn't professional, it just kind of brought me back to those times where I just wasn't being accepted for being me. And when she said this, I just remember getting immediately defensive, and I just kind of stopped and I was like, well, what's wrong with my hair? And she was like, you know, just kind of do something with it. It's just kind of not professional looking, and, you know, just kind of, you know, like, you know, we just don't want anything to fall out, and I'm like, why would something fall out? And it was just really awkward. Imagine to be a person who's just now accepting her natural hair pattern and someone to tell me that it's not professional and that it's actually a threat to our patients. I took it very personal.
I also had another clinical instructor, or a lab instructor, who upon my final evaluation told me, you know, you did really well for someone with a hearing impairment. And I just wanted to tell her, it's like, I did really well because I worked really hard. Like, nothing that I do in my life, you know, I've had to work harder in some areas because I have a disability.
The instructor was telling us about the population of Hospital X. And one of the stories that she presented to us was the fact that you build it, they will come. And I didn't understand what she meant by that, but she goes on to further explain that their population that did come there, they didn't want a prescription for Motrin. They wanted you to give them Motrin because it interfered with the money that they had available to get their hair and nails done.
She brought up the fact that in some of my papers, I might have a misspelling or two. And when I said, oh yeah, you know, that's typically something that I have to work on, it's always been a fault of mine. She asked me, was it cultural that I couldn't spell? So I thought, I was a little taken aback by that because, you know, clearly that's not a cultural issue, and I'm American.
I had a clinical instructor who was making fun of an employee at the hospital for being trans. It was a security guard. And the instructor was just talking about how the nurses were watching the person transition from being female to male and how it was weird and a bit strange. And I was so mad and so frustrated.
There's no doubt that there's another side to all of these stories. And one thing that we heard over and over from students is that they knew their instructors were not trying to be hurtful or mean. But we all need to understand that perception is that person's reality, and whatever the instructor meant to communicate is ultimately less important than the negative message that the student got about diversity and how acceptable it is in that clinical setting. Now, why do we need to be concerned about this? Really, what are the implications for the student, for their learning, or even for the patients? We asked folks to talk to us about the negative impact that we might see in the clinical setting. Let's hear what they had to say.
Because it sets up an awkwardness, it sets up a barrier between the student and the faculty and maybe even the clinical unit. And so it's going to influence learning, and it's going to influence the quality of care that the patient gets. And I'm always about the patient.
I think most people were just kind of like, okay, we can't even have a candid conversation because there's someone here in the room that is referring to a lesbian couple as a choice.
Yeah, when a clinical instructor sort of does something inappropriate or encourages an environment that doesn't respect diversity, I then don't even want to learn from them personally.
It really set the tone. It made me realize that if I had an ideal of I wanted to work in that specialty, I didn't want to work in that specialty. And it hindered my learning. It really created a barrier because I really didn't have much respect at that point, because I'm thinking, if you will say this in with the clinical group and with your students, then who else are you saying it to? So it hindered my 7 weeks of learning there, and but I realized what kind of nurse that I didn't want to be.
When someone says something negative about me and about something I can't change, such as my color or my hair, or attacks my intelligence, I take it personal, especially when I'm in this school and it's as competitive as it is. So in that clinical, I did well because I passed the clinical, because I was able to make those connections with the hospital staff, but I didn't do so well in the class because I was just, I really feel like I was traumatized. Like I just really felt like I just could never do anything well.
Now you have a sense of how a lack of respect for diversity can negatively impact students, their learning, and even patient care. So why don't they say something? Why didn't they speak up? What are the barriers to allowing a student to speak up, whether that's with an instructor or another peer on the unit? We need to understand those barriers if we're really going to try and make a change.
Didn't feel comfortable, and it really, for me, highlighted that power dynamic that happens in a hospital between a student and an instructor, even if you're the same age, or even if you're, comfortable and feel confident interacting with, and other aspects. If there's this, diversity issue, it's I was like, well, what if she's mean to me? Or what if she laughs at me? Or what if she, I don't know. I couldn't say anything, and I was really mad at myself for not being able to say anything.
Especially in a place where you're new, right at the beginning of the program, who's going to raise their hand and be like, what is wrong here? Because you don't want to be that person.
So I was really surprised by that, and it was the sort of situation where I was completely caught off guard, and I don't think I even said anything because I, was just sort of blown away by the fact that she said that. And so, yeah, unfortunately, I didn't at that moment have the wherewithal and courage, I guess, to speak up and to say something.
When those comments were made, I really didn't feel like I was in a situation where I could have spoken up about it. I didn't want to rock the boat. I just wanted to, get in, get out, get on with my life. At some point, too, you're in clinical, you're tired, and, at the end of the day, you don't want to always have to have a long conversation and feel like you have to educate someone else, too. I do love to do that when I have the chance, but for the onus to be on me to speak up and possibly, risk my grade or risk, how an instructor perceives me, that could affect a recommendation later down the line.
I didn't feel like it was my place to say anything to this instructor as to correct her or to educate her, because I was raised in a household where you respect your elders, and this person was much more older than me, and also she's in a position of authority, so who am I to challenge her? I'm sure there was probably a professional and courteous way that I could have informed her that, what she was saying was wrong or made me feel a certain type of way, but I've kind of learned here that I just need to choose my battles, and that just wasn't a battle that I needed to fight that day.
Now let's hear from another faculty. She's going to shed some light on another problem we've probably all seen at some point, and that's a lack of respect for diversity coming from nurses on the unit where we're working with students. Most importantly, she provides us with some practical suggestions for moving forward.
Sure, there are lots of barriers that exist for students to speak up with their clinical instructors. Often in clinical, students might feel nervous about expressing a concern with another staff member because they're guests on the unit, and they may feel threatened they may feel that if they report an interaction that is less than appropriate, that they might not be invited back to the unit. So it's important that the clinical instructor expresses to the students that there is no consequence in speaking up, and how valuable it is for them to communicate when something doesn't go right, or when someone says something that is offensive to someone else. In doing this, we are helping people. By being silent, we are suggesting that this is okay and that the interaction is appropriate or acceptable. And that's not the message we want to send to our students. We want them to know that they do have a voice, that it is okay to express their concerns, and that we will create a safe environment for them to do so.
Okay, did you get that? Create a safe environment. Safe for learning and safe for speaking up. When students feel safe speaking up, they can hold each other and really everyone in the Hopkins family responsible for respecting diversity. But how do you pull this off? In the next few minutes, we'll share some stories and some strategies to ensure that you can set up that safe environment for your clinical group.
One of our key expectations is being open to what we don't know.
And like, she was very open with like, I've never seen this before, but it's super interesting. I've read about it. Here's the patient. Let them tell you about it. And that sort of honesty, because like, you respect them then for being honest and open just as much as you respect them for what they do know.
As healthcare providers, we're trained in pattern recognition. So to think through, oh, someone looks pale and their nails are blanching and maybe they're anemic, right? We put those signs and perhaps symptoms together. But it's a unfortunately small leap to pattern recognition of thinking, oh, this person is from this ethnicity, and so maybe they did this to get themselves in this situation. And that's where we can get ourselves in trouble. We have to treat each patient freshly in terms of what is going on with them, yet we have all this training to recognize patterns. So it's something we have to consciously say to ourselves, do I have evidence to conclude what I've concluded about this person's motives or why they're here or what they've done?
When you're getting a report about a patient, that you hear something that would be respecting diversity would be not hearing anything except for strictly the facts of the disease, what's going on with them, and not like the extra added details like this person, none of the extra added details that might actually pass judgment on the person.
When you step into a role as an instructor, you're really not only impacting the way that nurses are going to practice, but you're going to impact like the way that they understand patients and understand diverse patients. And even if you have certain views, which you're absolutely entitled to have, I think it's really important that you really familiarize yourself with those views and understand your own, your own opinions, so that when you're communicating with students and when you're teaching students to interact with patients in ways, you're doing it from an unbiased perspective.
One of the expectations of clinical faculty is that they're willing to learn from students and patients.
I've had some instructors who were very clearly amazing in the clinical realm and just did not leave any room for any of us to know anything other than, like they're so focused on getting us to be good nurses, which is great, that's why we're here, that they were then ignoring the fact that we might have something to share and to, help them learn about anything.
There are some people who do a wonderful job and who, if they're talking about something that somebody raises their hand and say, actually, you're speaking about my culture, they're like, oh, please, you go ahead. Like, you tell us, because I want to learn from you. It doesn't matter, like, that I'm the one with the degrees and the research. Like, this is your heritage, and so you tell us. And, like, that feeling is awesome. But you don't always get it. And when you don't get it, it says to other people that this is okay. And that's disappointing.
There was a patient who was from India on my OB floor, And the instructor asked me, how culturally, how can you approach that person differently, because she didn't know. So I was able to provide some insight into, from my diverse background, about how we can talk and how the culture is like for women from India or the family itself.
Well, I think that we need to realize that we're all humans and that we can all make mistakes, and that, it's important to treat others as we would want to be treated, and that we should acknowledge it and apologize and move on. And, I think our students would value that we have humility and that we are respectful of their needs.
And if I offended anyone, then I apologize for that. It would have made a difference, because I really feel like people make, say things or make mistakes, and then they realize that it wasn't the right thing to say, and they recover. And it's all about forgiveness, though, too. So I would have respected that if she would have simply came back and apologized for what she said, but that didn't happen.
So if she had come to me and been like, "Hey, you seemed uncomfortable," or "Hey, I hear you've been doing a lot of transgender advocacy at the School of Nursing, and I said this thing," I would have been like, "Oh, well, great. Let's talk about it. This is a thing that a lot of people don't know much about," and I would have been happy to talk about it.
That instructor could pull that student to the side during clinical hours and say, "Hey, I said this yesterday, and I went home and reflected on this. That what I said, I felt it wasn't appropriate."
It'd be much easier if an instructor maybe felt, "Ooh, that didn't go so great," or "I wonder if that was the right thing to say," and just ask me about it and open up a dialogue between the two of us.
All right, so we've covered 3 key strategies. First, know what you don't know. That comes from being aware about what you don't know and understanding where your biases lie, because we all have them. Strategy number 2, be willing to learn from others. There's no question that students depend on faculty for expertise, but remember, students bring unique things to the table as well. This is adult education, and we expect learning and respect to go both ways. And finally, number 3, despite our best intentions, we are going to misstep. We've all done it, and we'll probably all do it again. We need to learn how to deal with that when it happens. So we are confident that if you tap into these 3 strategies, you'll be able to set up that safe environment, one that really respects diversity and makes it better clinical for you and your students. As a clinical instructor here at Hopkins, we want you to know how seriously we take diversity, and we expect you to do the same. We're going to be sending the same message to all the other faculty, students, and staff. And if for any reason you hear or observe something that doesn't reflect this value, please speak up so we can address it. Silence only suggests it's acceptable. In addition to the 3 strategies that we already talked about, while we were putting this video together, students, faculty, and staff gave us some other great tidbits and ideals about what a clinical instructor does to really create a safe environment for those students. So let's take a listen to some of those suggestions, and that'll give you even more strategies to use with your clinical group.
Before starting clinical, they can send out an email, "Oh, tell me more about yourself," with a few questions, like where you're from, your hobbies, what culture you prefer. It's some general questions about, so the instructors get to know students well before starting clinicals.
My suggestion to the clinical faculty or nursing instructors that were working with students in the clinical setting would be to talk to each student as just that. Like, don't vary your tone or your speech or your conversation style dependent on the student's background, because you don't know where anyone came from.
Well, I guess if I had to choose qualities that I would find in an ideal instructor, the first thing I would want to do is, I kind of mentioned this before, but I'd like to not hear the extraneous details about the patient. I'd like to hear strictly the facts. I want to hear just the disease and what exactly is going on. I don't think it's important. I don't think that's the kind of time where you should insert your own opinions. So I think maybe an instructor that would value and respect the autonomy of the patient and maybe not pass judgment before I even met them yet.
I had one clinical instructor who was very cognizant of setting a good tone in terms of diversity. On the very first day in our first post-clinical conference, she pulled out a list of maybe some stereotypes or different minority groups, you know, Catholic, gay, African American, poverty, and then you had to write the first two things that came to your mind about it, just on the very first day of setting the tone of this is something that impacts health that you aren't taught in your class, but it's something that you have to be cognizant of. It was a really great skill to have just set out on the first day.
This brings us to the end of the video. I hope you have a better sense of what we expect of instructors with respect to diversity and some ideas about how to make it happen. There are more resources available for you on Blackboard on the Clinical Instructor site. For now, we'll bring this to a close with some final words by Dean Davidson and some expert student advice.
We know that what happens in the clinical settings is 10 times more valuable and signals 10 times more merit than what the teacher says in the classroom. So I see clinical instructors as being critical in us achieving our aims in educating and developing nurses of the future.
If you're going to be teaching students in the clinical environment, embrace the values and our mission of the school. Do that and articulate that to the students. Everybody has them. But when you're teaching us, embrace the values.